Velostation 7 sits at the intersection of three major transit lanes in what the conclave officially calls the mid-corridor sectors. It's a junction point, the kind of place that exists entirely because of geography, not because anyone particularly wanted to build a city there. 600,000 permanent residents, roughly 2 million transiting through on any given cycle, and a bureaucratic apparatus so large and so complicated that the station had its own dedicated conclave administrative wing that employed more people than some smaller member worlds. I'd been posted there for 11 years by the time this happened. Long enough that I knew which food stalls in the lower concourse had the best early cycle service, which transit corridors smelled like coolant leaks, and which of the administrative staff were actually worth talking to when you needed something done quickly. The hub itself, the central transit and processing facility, was enormous, even by conclave standards, which tend toward the grandiose. It had been expanded 6 times since original construction, and it showed. The original architecture, all smooth Velocian stone curves and indirect lighting, kept colliding with whatever utilitarian additions the station authority had bolted on during each expansion. The result was a space that felt like several different buildings had been stacked inside each other, confusing at first. You got used to it. The processing level was where authorization happened. Every species that moved through Velostation 7 passed through processing. That was the rule, and it had been the rule since the station's founding. You arrived, you presented credentials, you received transit authorization, and you moved on. Simple. The processing terminals were arranged in long rows, 47 rows, each row holding 64 terminals, and the whole thing operated on a rotating shift schedule that kept the floor staffed around the clock. I was there that cycle because of a minor diplomatic complaint from the URETH delegation. Something about their authorization queue times being longer than the Fennicar delegations. Completely routine. The kind of thing I dealt with constantly. I had my tablet, I had my notes. I was going to walk the floor, time a few queues, write a report, and go home. I was halfway through the second row when I noticed something was wrong. The thing I noticed. It wasn't dramatic at first. There was a commotion near the far end of row 19. I could see raised voices, body language that suggested agitation, a small cluster of people that had stopped moving and were looking at something. In a transit hub, this is actually unusual. Most species on a transit hub are trying to get through as quickly as possible. Stopping is inefficient. Whatever they were looking at had made them decide inefficiency was worth it. I moved that way. Slowly at first because I was still timing the URETH queue and I didn't want to lose my count. Then a little faster because the cluster was growing. By the time I reached row 19, there were maybe 40 people standing in a loose arc, all facing the same direction. They were facing a human. Now that shouldn't have been remarkable. Humans used Velostation 7 constantly. They were one of the most common transit species in the mid-corridor sectors by that point. You saw them everywhere. In the food stalls, in the waiting areas, moving through the corridors with that particular quality of motion that humans have slightly faster than you expect, always looking around at things, giving off an impression of barely contained energy even when they're standing still. This one was standing very still. He was at a terminal in row 19, terminal 19 Gamma 7. I noted it later for my report, and the terminal was showing a red indicator, which meant it had flagged something, which almost never happened. The automated processing system was very good. When it flagged a traveler, it was almost always something serious. The station security officer who'd responded to the flag was a Velocian woman named Cora Dreth. I knew her. Good at her job, calm under pressure, not the type to escalate unnecessarily. She was standing about a meter from the human, and even from a distance I could see that she had the specific expression of someone who had encountered a problem she didn't know how to solve. The human, I'll describe him properly in a moment. I want to get the context right first. was standing at the terminal with his arms crossed. Not aggressively, not the way someone who's causing trouble crosses their arms, the way someone who is extremely tired and extremely patient crosses their arms while waiting for something they've been waiting for before. That was the first thing I noticed about him, the patience, not the irritation you'd expect from someone who'd been flagged, just waiting. The human. His name, as I later learned, was Davin Reese. He was a cargo transit specialist, the kind of human who spent most of their working life on ships, moving things between systems, maintaining supply lines for operations that were too small for conclave freight services, but too complex for standard courier runs. He was somewhere in his middle years by human reckoning, which I was still not very good at estimating at that point. Dark skin, close-cropped hair starting to go gray at the edges, the particular build that humans who do physical work tend to develop, not large exactly, but dense, like the weight is distributed differently than you'd expect. He was wearing a cargo transit uniform, the practical kind, not the branded kind, lots of pockets, worn at the elbows, and he had a transit bag over one shoulder that was clearly very heavy, and that he was holding with the ease of someone who'd been carrying heavy things for a long time. He looked at me when I walked up. Not at Cora, who was still talking, at me, like he'd noticed I was the ranking official in the area and had simply decided to wait until I arrived, which was either very perceptive or very experienced, possibly both. Observer, he said, not a greeting exactly, an acknowledgement. What seems to be the issue? I asked. I was looking at Cora as I said it, but he answered. The terminal flagged me, he said. She's asking me to step aside for manual processing. Standard procedure when there's a flag, I said. Yes, he said, I know, the issue is what it's flagged me for. Cora handed me her scanner, which was showing the flag record. I looked at it. And I stopped. Because the flag, the reason this terminal had lit red and pulled a security officer and stopped 40 people in their tracks, was Section 14, Subsection 9, Paragraph 2. What the flag said. Let me explain how authorization flags work. When a traveler goes through a conclave processing terminal, the system checks their credentials against a set of authorization requirements specific to their species and transit classification. Most species have a fairly extensive set of requirements: entry permits, health clearances, commercial transit certifications, political clearances if they're coming from certain member worlds. The system checks all of these automatically, and if everything is in order, it gives you a green light and you move on. If something is missing or expired or flagged for review, the system stops you and tells you what needs to be resolved. The authorization requirements for each species are laid out in the Conclave Charter. Section 14 covers transit authorization specifically. It lists every recognized species and every requirement that applies to them. For the Urath, 41 separate requirements. For the Fennicar, 38. For the Velocians, my own species, 52. Most of them historical carryovers from agreements made before the current charter. For the Keth, 63, which was a number that irritated the Keth delegation endlessly, though the Keth had signed all 63 themselves. For species from the outer Concordat, variable between 20 and 90, depending on specific world of origin. Section 14, Subsection 9, Paragraph 2 was the human entry. I had read it before. I knew what it said. But standing there with Cora's scanner in my hand, looking at it as an active flag record, it felt different. The human entry in Section 14 read as follows. Human transit authorization requirements, none specified. Human travelers are exempt from standard transit authorization protocols under the unrestricted clause, see Appendix 7C. Human transit is permitted in all conclave sectors, including restricted and high-security designations, without prior authorization, credential verification, or species-specific clearance. This exemption is permanent and non-negotiable, and applies to all individual human travelers regardless of political affiliation, commercial classification, or transit purpose. The flag the terminal had generated was not a flag for the human. The terminal hadn't flagged him because he was missing something. The terminal had flagged him because it didn't know what to do with a traveler who needed nothing. The system had been designed to process travelers with authorization requirements. Every species it was built to handle had a list. When it encountered someone with no list, it didn't have a pathway for that. So it had done the only thing it knew how to do. It called a human error. The human standing in front of me with his arms crossed was not being stopped because he'd done something wrong. He was being stopped because the system literally could not process the fact that he didn't need to be processed. The crowd. The 40 people who had gathered were of at least 8 different species. I recognized Phenicari, Ureth, 2 Keth who must have been on a commercial run, a handful of Velocians, and some outer Concordat travelers I couldn't immediately identify. They were quiet in the way that large groups get quiet when they're paying attention. Cora was explaining the situation to me in the low, precise voice she used when she was embarrassed about something. The system generated the flag automatically. I can override it, but the override requires a supervisor code, and the supervisor on shift is Marin, and Marin is asking for documentation that this is a legitimate exemption and not a credential forgery. It's in the charter, I said. Yes, Cora said. I explained that. Marin wants to see the charter reference verified by. It's section 14, subsection 9, I said. I know, Cora said. Marin is very thorough. The human Davin Reese had uncrossed his arms. He was watching this exchange with an expression I found difficult to read at first. It wasn't frustration. It wasn't amusement exactly. It was something in between, like watching something you've seen many times before unfold in exactly the way you knew it would. How long has this been happening? I asked him directly. He thought about it, not in the way someone thinks when they're trying to remember, in the way someone thinks when they're deciding how much to explain. I've been through processing hubs maybe 400 times, he said. Give or take. This happens, he moved his hand in a small gesture, maybe a third of those times. The systems flag me because they don't know how to handle the exemption. Then someone has to explain it, someone has to verify it. Sometimes someone has to call a supervisor. Sometimes the supervisor calls their supervisor. And then you go through. And then I go through, he confirmed. Yes. Does it bother you? The question was out before I decided to ask it. I was an observer. Asking personal questions wasn't really my function, but something about the conversation had made me curious in a way I hadn't expected. He looked at me for a moment. Not anymore, he said. What Marin said. Supervisor Marin arrived 11 minutes later. I knew Marin by reputation, a Velocian bureaucrat of the old school, very correct, very procedural, deeply suspicious of anything that didn't fit a known category. He was technically good at his job, but his definition of good was adhering precisely to established process, which is exactly the kind of person who has trouble when the established process doesn't cover a situation. He looked at the flag record, he looked at Davin Reese, he looked at me. This is the human, he said. Yes, I said. He's claiming the unrestricted clause. He's not claiming it, I said. He doesn't need to claim it, it applies automatically. The system flagged his credentials. The system flagged him because it doesn't have a processing pathway for 0 requirements, I said. That's a system design issue, not a credential issue. Marin looked at his own scanner. He pulled up the charter reference, which I watched him actually read. His expression did the thing that faces do when they encounter information they technically knew but hadn't really sat with. A small rearrangement, a recalibration. "Why does he have no requirements?" Marin said. And that was the question. That was always the question, eventually. I had heard it before. Every conclave official who encounters the unrestricted clause for the first time truly encounters it, not just reads it in a training document, eventually asks that question. Why does he have no requirements? The answer is in Appendix 7C, which is 46 pages long and written in the dry, careful language of people who were trying very hard to explain something without saying what it meant. But the actual answer, the short version, the one that cuts through the procedural language and gets to the thing itself, was standing in row 19, waiting. I looked at Davin Reese. "Would you like to explain it?" I asked, "or would you prefer I do?" He looked at me, that half-readable expression again. "You go ahead," he said, "I've heard it." Appendix 7C, translated into plain language. The conclave was founded 1100 years ago. 1100 years ago, humanity was not yet a member. They'd been contacted about 40 years prior, had attended some preliminary negotiation sessions, had sent observers to the founding conference, and then had not signed the original charter. This was, at the time, considered a minor complication. The founding species had expected humanity to simply join. Every other contacted species had joined. The logic of joining was obvious: a galactic governing compact with trade agreements, mutual defense protocols, conflict resolution mechanisms, and infrastructure support. Why would you not join? The humans sent back a polite letter explaining that they were interested in eventually joining, but that before they signed anything, they wanted to understand exactly what they were signing. They asked for time to review the charter in its entirety. They were given time. What followed was, depending on who tells the story, either a masterpiece of diplomatic strategy or a simple expression of human caution. Possibly both. Over the next 20 years, humanity reviewed the charter. Not just the main document, the appendices, the supporting agreements, the historical precedents, the side letters, the interpretive guidelines. Every word. And they sent back questions. Not hostile questions, careful questions. Questions like, under the conflict resolution mechanism in Section 31, what happens if the conclave itself is a party to a dispute? Who resolves that? And questions like, the Mutual Defense Protocol requires member species to contribute forces proportional to their registered military capacity. How is military capacity defined, and who certifies the measurements? And questions like, Section 14's transit authorization requirements. Who has the authority to add new requirements to a species list? And what is the process for challenging a requirement that is applied incorrectly? The founding species answered the questions. Then the humans asked more questions about the answers. This went on for quite a while. At some point, historians still argue about exactly when the founding species realized that the humans were not being obstructionist. They were being systematic. They were reading the charter the way you read a contract when you are genuinely trying to understand every obligation you are accepting. And slowly, through this process of questions and answers, some things became apparent. The charter had gaps. Not many and not catastrophic, but gaps. Places where the language was ambiguous, or where two clauses implied different things in edge cases, or where an assumption had been baked in that was never made explicit. Most species had signed without finding these gaps because they had been reading the charter politically, looking for things that were obviously unfair, rather than structurally. The humans found the structural gaps. When they finally came back to the table, after 20 years, they came with a list, proposed amendments. They weren't demanding them as conditions. They were offering them as improvements, with full explanations of what each one addressed and why. The conclave accepted almost all of them. And then humanity signed. And the conclave, in recognition of what had just happened, added something to Section 14. Because during those 20 years of questions and answers, something else had become clear. The founding species had spent 2 decades watching humanity approach a massive, complex, multilateral agreement with patient, methodical, relentless care, watching them read everything, ask about everything, find things that 2 generations of conclave legal experts had missed. And somewhere in those 2 decades, the founding species had developed a particular feeling about humanity that they couldn't quite name. It wasn't fear. It wasn't admiration exactly, though there was admiration in it. It was something closer to. We would rather have these people moving freely through everything we have built than have them stopped at any door. Because a species that reads like that questions like that works like that, stopping them at doors was not going to make you safer. It was just going to mean you had done the stopping. So they wrote the unrestricted clause. Human transit is permitted in all conclave sectors, including restricted and high-security designations, without prior authorization, credential verification, or species-specific clearance. Permanent, non-negotiable. The opposite of restriction. What MARREN did with that information? He stood very still for a moment. Then he cleared the flag. It took about 4 seconds. Davin Reese nodded, not a thank you exactly, more an acknowledgement, and picked up his transit bag. He moved toward the departure corridor with the specific ease of someone who knows exactly where they're going. I watched the crowd dissolve. The 40 people who had gathered went back to their own processing queues, their own movements, their own transit agendas. Cora caught my eye. She had an expression I recognized, the expression of someone who has just learned something they're going to think about for a while. "Does that happen a lot?" she asked. "The flag or the explanation?" "Both." "The flag, yes," I said. "The explanation, less often. Usually someone just overrides it and moves on." She looked toward the departure corridor, where Davin Reese had gone. He was already out of sight. 20 years, she said, to read a treaty. "And then they asked questions about the answers," I said. She was quiet for a moment. "That's not," she started, then stopped. "What?" "I was going to say that's not how species usually join things," she said. "But I think what I actually mean is that's not how anyone usually joins things." She was right, it wasn't. The part that keeps staying with me. I filed my report on the URFQ complaint. I noted the Row 19 incident as a secondary observation. I recommended that the processing level update its system to include a dedicated pathway for unrestricted clause travelers, so the automated flag would stop triggering. That recommendation went through review and was approved 14 months later. The system update was implemented 17 months after that. So for another 31 months, the terminal in Row 19 kept flagging humans and security officers kept being confused, and supervisors kept pulling up Section 14 on their scanners with that same expression. I know this because I was still there, still timing cues, still writing reports. But I kept thinking about what Cora had said. That's not how anyone usually joins things. And I kept thinking about Davin Reese, standing at the terminal with his arms crossed, tired, patient, having been through this 400 times, having developed the specific quality of waiting that comes from knowing that eventually, always, the system would sort itself out and you would move on. Not angry. Not performing patience, genuinely patient. Because he knew something that the terminal didn't know, and he knew it, and the only thing left to do was wait. I thought about what kind of experience produces that quality in a person. What it means to move through a galaxy where every door eventually opens for you. Not because you forced them open, not because you had power over the people behind them, but because the people who built the doors, long ago, had decided that you should be able to move freely. And I thought about why they'd decided that. Because it hadn't been a gift. The unrestricted clause wasn't given to humanity because the conclave felt generous. It wasn't charity. It wasn't even exactly respect, in the way we usually mean respect. It was something older than any of those things. It was what happens when a group of people, an entire civilization, in this case, encounters another group of people and watches them work. Really work. The way humans worked on that treaty. Patient, methodical, thorough, reading everything, asking about everything, finding the things that were missing, not to exploit them, not to hold them over anyone, but because if you're going to sign something, you should know what you're signing. That kind of work changes how you see the people doing it. The second incident. 3 cycles after the Row 19 event, I was back on the processing level for a different reason. A credential dispute involving an outer Concordat trade vessel, when I encountered Davin Reese again. Not at a terminal this time. He was sitting at the food stall near the East Concourse entry, just sitting there, eating something from a container, watching the processing floor. He had the particular stillness of someone who has nowhere they urgently need to be. I hesitated. I wasn't sure he'd remember me. There was no particular reason he should. I was one of dozens of officials he'd encountered in one of hundreds of processing hubs. But he looked up before I decided whether to approach, and he gave me a small nod of recognition. I sat down. "Still here?" he asked. 11 years, I said. He nodded, long posting. "It's a good hub," I said. Which was true, in the way that things you've spent 11 years with are true, not because they're objectively the best, but because they're yours. "What brings you back to the floor?" he asked. I explained the Concordat dispute. He listened with the particular attention that people who work in logistics give to problems of credential and authorization, a professional interest. "Concordat paperwork is a mess," he said. "Their member worlds don't all use the same credential format. I've had to delay 3 runs in the last 2 years because a world I'd transited a dozen times had quietly updated their format and nobody had told the processing hubs." "That's actually relevant to what I'm dealing with," I said. "Happy to look at it if it would help." I showed him the credential record on my tablet. He looked at it for a few minutes with focused attention, found the format discrepancy in about 90 seconds, something I hadn't found in an hour of going back and forth with the Concordat desk. "There," he said, pointing at a field. "That identifier code, it's the old format. The world updated their system in year 7438, but the transit hub databases weren't all updated at the same time. Your system is reading this against the old identifier list and can't match it." "How do you know that?" "Had the same problem with a different Concordat world last year." A small pause. I asked a lot of questions until I understood why it was happening. "Right." I looked at him. He was already back to his food. "Can I ask you something?" I said. "You can ask." "Do you know why the unrestricted clause exists?" He was quiet for a moment, not in the way someone is quiet when they don't know the answer, in the way someone is quiet when they're deciding how to say something they've thought about before. "The official reason," he said, "is in Appendix 7C. "Yes. What they say there," he said slowly, "is that it was a recognition of humanity's contribution to the Charter's development and a demonstration of conclave trust in human good faith. That's what it says. That's the diplomatic language." He set down his food container. "The real reason, what I've come to think is the real reason, from talking to a lot of people over a lot of years, is that the founding species got scared." That wasn't what I expected. "Scared?" I said. "Not of us," he said. "Or not exactly, scared of what it would mean to restrict us. They watched us go through that treaty for 20 years, asking questions about the answers, finding things, And at some point I think they realized, he paused, choosing words carefully, that a species like that, you don't want them on the other side of closed doors. You don't want to wonder what they found. You want them in the room. He picked up his food container again. So they put us in all the rooms, he said. The third incident. This one I only heard about secondhand. A colleague of mine, a section observer posted to a high-security transit hub in the inner sectors, sent me an account about 8 months after my conversation with Davin Reese at the food stall. She knew I'd had the Row 19 incident and thought I'd find her account interesting. She was right. The high-security hub she was posted to had stricter authorization requirements than Velos Station 7. Much stricter. Not just species-based requirements, but purpose-based ones. Travelers going through had to declare their transit purpose and provide documentation supporting it. There were additional biometric checks. Secondary interviews for certain categories of traveler. A human had arrived for transit. The human, a woman named Orrin Cassie, an independent researcher of some kind, had cleared the automated processing in the way humans usually cleared automated processing, which is to say the system had flagged her, someone had looked at her credentials, and then she'd been waved through because that is what Section 14 requires. But she'd had to wait for about 40 minutes while this was sorted out. While she was waiting, she'd apparently read the notice board in the waiting area. The notice board at this particular hub listed the authorization requirements for the transit sector, the standard one that my colleague's hub covered. It was a long list, multiple columns, requirements for every registered species, their categories, their documentation needs. When Orrin Cassie was finally cleared and a processing officer came to bring her through, she asked a question. She pointed at the list. She said, specifically, I noticed that the third entry in the FENICAR requirements column references a health clearance protocol that was updated in year 7430, but the protocol number here matches the pre-update version. Does that mean you're checking FENICAR travelers against outdated health requirements? The processing officer, to her credit, took this seriously. She checked. She found that yes, the notice board was outdated, which meant the processing terminal's reference list was probably also outdated, which meant that FENICAR travelers had been checked against an 11-year-old health protocol for an unknown amount of time. They updated the system. They reviewed the affected travelers. Nothing serious had been missed, the update had been minor, but the error was real and it was caught. Because a human read a notice board while waiting. Not looking for an error, not trying to cause trouble, just reading. The way humans apparently read things, everything all the time because information is information. My colleague's message ended. I'm starting to think the unrestricted clause is not actually about letting them go everywhere. I think it's about keeping them somewhere they can read things. What I wrote in MY Final Report. I was transferred off Velos Station 7 2 years after the Row 19 incident. A new posting, a different sector, a different set of bureaucratic tangles to observe and document. Before I left, I wrote a summary report on my 11 years at the hub. Standard practice, observations, recommendations, notes on recurring issues. In the section on recurring administrative challenges, I included the following. The unrestricted clause, Section 14, subsection 9, paragraph 2, continues to generate automated processing flags at the station's transit terminals due to system design limitations. The terminals are built around the assumption that all travelers have authorization requirements to be checked. Human travelers have none, and the system responds to this with an error flag rather than a clear pathway. This has been noted for system update, which has been approved but not yet fully implemented. The practical effect is that human travelers are periodically stopped and delayed while the system error is resolved. The delays are typically minor, under an hour in most cases, and are resolved without incident. It should be noted that during my time at the station, I observed on several occasions that human travelers, during their periods of delay, engaged with their immediate environment in ways that produced useful information. Questions asked, observations made, and errors noticed during these delays have, in at least 3 documented cases, contributed to the identification and correction of systemic issues in the hub's authorization and processing infrastructure. This is not presented as a justification for the delays, which remain an administrative failure that should be corrected. It is presented as an observation that the human relationship with information, specifically the tendency to read, question, and notice, produces value in direct proportion to the environments they are placed in. This is, I believe, what the founders understood. It is a difficult thing to articulate in bureaucratic language, but it is perhaps the most important thing I have learned in 11 years of sector observation. I don't know if anyone read that section of the report. Probably it went into a file somewhere, appropriately tagged, appropriately ignored. But I wrote it. It felt necessary. The thing that really shocked the galaxy. I should be honest about the title I gave this account. The reason shocked the galaxy, that's the kind of phrasing that implies a dramatic revelation, a gasp, a moment where everything changes. It implies something happening quickly. That's not quite what happened. What happened was slower than that, and more quiet, and in some ways more unsettling. The shock wasn't a single event. It was the accumulation of thousands of moments like the ones I've described, thousands of processing flags, thousands of waiting humans reading things, thousands of questions asked and errors noticed and gaps found. The galaxy didn't gasp. It just slowly, gradually, over decades and then centuries, developed a feeling. The feeling was something like, we keep building things and they keep finding what's wrong with them. Not maliciously. That's the part that took the longest to absorb. There was no agenda, no strategy, no coordinated effort by humanity to audit the conclave's infrastructure. They just noticed things, because they read things, because they asked questions about the answers. And every time a processing hub got a system update because a human in a waiting area caught an outdated protocol, every time a transit regulation was amended because a human logistics specialist found an inconsistency, every time an administrative error was corrected because a human cargo runner had apparently memorized a section of the charter, the galaxy learned something. It learned what the founders had understood 200 years earlier when they wrote the unrestricted clause. That the most dangerous thing you could do with a species like this was stop them at a door. Not because of what they'd do when stopped, because of what you'd miss. The last time I saw DAVA and REC. It was the day before I left for my transfer. I was in the main concourse picking up a few things from the supply stalls. And I saw him, or someone I was almost certain was him, though he'd aged another 2 years and the gray at his temples was more extensive now, moving through the concourse toward the departure corridors. He was carrying his transit bag, moving with that same unhurried but purposeful motion. He glanced at me as he passed. I'm not certain he recognized me. There was no nod of acknowledgement, not the way there had been at the food stall. But he paused for just a moment. He looked up at the transit information board hanging over the concourse, the big one that listed departures and authorizations and sector updates. He read it, all of it, I think, or at least a significant portion of it, in the space of about 15 seconds. Then he continued walking. I don't know if he found anything on that board. I don't know if there was anything to find. Maybe he was just checking his departure time. Maybe it was habit, some kind of deep-wired reflex to take in information that was in front of him. Maybe it was both. He disappeared into the departure corridor. I stood there for a moment, watching the spot where he'd been. Then I went to finish my packing. Closing note, filed by Sector Observer THIRENVA, VLOSSIAN Diplomatic Registry. This account is personal, not official. It does not carry the weight of formal conclave documentation. It is simply what I observed and what I came to think it meant during 11 years at a transit hub where nothing very important was supposed to happen. I am filing it in the public registry because the unrestricted clause is public record, and the reasoning behind it should be as well, not the Appendix 7C version, which is accurate but dry, but the version that comes from watching it in practice. The reason every species needs authorization, and humans don't, is not complicated once you see it. Every other species arrives at the door and waits to be let in. Humans arrive at the door and read the sign. And then they ask why the sign says that, and whether the wording is current, and whether the protocol it references has been updated recently, and whether there's a better way to phrase it that would reduce confusion for travelers from the outer concordat who use a different notation system. And then they go through. The galaxy took a long time to understand that these were not two separate things, the reading and the going through, that the freedom of movement and the way they move are connected, that the unrestricted clause was not a reward for humanity. It was a confession from the people who wrote it about what they had understood. We cannot stop them at the door, not because they would force it open, because if we stop them at the door, we will lose what they would have seen on the other side.